The report by the World Values Survey and King's College London's Policy Institute compares data from the UK with 23 other countries, surveying 3,000 adults from within the United Kingdom. But what has led to this decline, and what does it mean for the future of our nation? That brings us to today's Jewel. And to debate this topic, I'm joined by my brilliant duelists, my sidekick Emma Webb and nemesis Aaron Bastani. Why is Britain losing touch with God? Aaron Bastani, let's start with you this week.
This data is super interesting, and some of it's very counterintuitive. So to start, 53% of millennials, that's the birth cohort I'm from, believe in life after death. That's 18% higher than baby boomers, so my parents' generation. Only 35% of baby boomers believe in life after death. It's much higher for millennials. Similarly, 51% of Gen Z believe in life after death, but only 37% believe in God. So you're actually seeing, in a strange way, this is just a hypothesis here going off this data, you're seeing arguably a growth in, I don't like the word spiritualism, quite loose. There's clearly a belief in a higher being and a higher power, but it's not really being reflected in a belief in organised religion and organised faith. And I think that probably reflects a fundamental human need for these things, especially in times of crisis and instability, with what we see with regards to, for instance, discourses around climate change and pandemics. It makes sense for a young person to all of a sudden find these ideas very appealing, but like you say, that doesn't look like the faith of the 19th, 20th centuries.
I would say it's because it's innate. I would say it's imprinted on our DNA, in our conscience, that we know there is something bigger. We know there's an afterlife. We know there's a God. However, Emma, I would say it's actually people being biblically illiterate. And this is the reason everyone's spiritual these days and don't necessarily know how to define it. Is it because we have a state church that has failed in its duty to educate people?
I think that's certainly part of the problem, but it's a bit chicken or egg when it comes to the Anglican Church, because I think we have seen, since the 40s, 50s, even earlier than the 1960s, this gradual wave of atheism. And actually Orwell, when he writes about in the 30s, and he's writing about the Anglican Church, his descriptions chime completely with the situation that we have today. So I think it's part of the problem. I think you're right that there is a kind of theological illiteracy, and I think we don't really understand as a nation, and we're failing to pass on to our children a knowledge and understanding of the Christian cultural foundations of the society that we live in. And obviously that's a problem because it leads to a distortion and a lack of understanding about the sort of like basic ecosystem of things like our constitutional framework and whatnot. It's actually very interesting, I think, going back to what Aaron was saying, and anecdotally, karma seems to be something that is very popular amongst people younger than the generation below mine. And I think that there is a need there, and it's been pointed out many times in relation to social justice activism, in relation to climate catastrophism, that there is this kind of religious fervour, almost Puritan fervour, as Andrew Doyle has written about so brilliantly in his book, The New Puritans. There's this kind of fervour amongst young people that is lacking a kind of Christian receptacle. And so it's going off in all sorts of strange and unusual ways. So I think we're not actually really seeing the decline of religion as such. It may be that we're seeing the decline of religion as we know it. And part of that is, I think, a result of theological illiteracy, because I think many people who are culturally Christian, who are, Brits born and bred, and that is absolutely their cultural inheritance. There's a lot of misunderstanding there. And I count myself amongst that. When I was younger, I think that the Church of England even was teaching me a false and slightly distorted understanding of our Christian foundations.
And is this not a wider problem? Emma's talked about a lack of understanding in our infrastructure and our environment around us, but surely this is a lack of understanding in the very way that we live, such as, marriage rates dropping, birth rates dropping, abortion rates rising. Is this not all a knock-on effect of our lack of understanding of the faith?
It's an interesting one, because if you look at Poland and Malta, and of course faith has declined in these countries too, but I think Malta didn't legalise divorce until very recently. And those countries have the lowest birth rates in Europe. Famously, Catholic countries have lower birth rates, and they have higher rates of church attendance than Northern European ones.
Sound.
So it's an interesting question. I think there's something deeper going on, and I think it really, for instance, you talked about birth rates, divorce, and so on. I think lots of that really that can be seen across many societies, across multiple continents over time. And I think it's to do with urbanisation, capitalist development. I mean, I'm using that in very neutral terms. I'm not criticising it, it's just an observation. So I don't think necessarily the decline of faith. I mean, it's interesting if you look at somewhere like Israel, which is the counter-argument. You have, I think, for regular liberal Israeli Jews, birth rate of something like 1.5, and then obviously for ultra-Orthodox Jews, 6 or 7.
Yeah.
So you have a living experiment there where actually more religious people than a country are more likely to have children. It's an interesting one. So I think that's partly true. I don't think it's the whole story. And in terms of, for instance, mental health, you know, the crisis of mental health we have in this country and across the West, I find it really remarkable, actually, when you think about it, when you reflect on it, that religious leaders have offered so little.
Yeah.
So little. You know, if you think about the message of the church, you don't have to agree with it, you can be an atheist, but the idea of forgiveness if you repent and love, very powerful, and people need those, and I think you're right that reflects a human urge.
But even more than that, we should be telling people that Christ is with them in their suffering.
Well, actually, I think part of the problem with the Anglican Church is that it's almost become a kind of cult of well-being rather than actually solidly theologically Christian. And so in some ways, maybe they do believe that they are catering to a mental health crisis, but on the other hand, they're not doing so in a Christian way. They're doing so by kind of trying to conform themselves to this sort of what they think is a kind of popular wellness motif or something. So it's interesting, and I think that you mentioned the birth rates, that Mary Harrington has been very forthright in pointing out that actually that women and families in general want to have, the statistics show that we want to have more children than we're having. We are a disappointed society. In the developing world, we are disappointed societies because we want to have more children than we're having. And there seems to be something fundamentally broken about the social fabric. And I think that part of that is, and again, it's a bit chicken or egg, is to do with the decline of religion. Because as you say, religious communities do tend to have more children. But I think that there's something much more fundamental going on here, and that's also part of what is eroding religion, as well as religion failing to contribute to mending the problem.
Very good. That is our very reasonable duel between Emma and Aaron. Thank you both very much for that.